Hi, this is Cheryl Johnson, and this is part one of our Birth to Three series addressing assessments and evaluations for deaf and hard of hearing children. This is module 3 of a 6-part series dealing with eligibility and the IFSP, or the Individual Family Service Plan, as well as transition to school age. So again, just to clarify definitions, the laws that are passed by Congress go to the U.S. Department of Education, or whatever the appropriate agency, depending on the laws, for regulations to be developed. And so we're addressing regulations that have been developed that define how services are delivered. Part C, or Birth to Three eligibility, begins with the evaluation of the child and then follows with assessment of the child and family. So the evaluation is for eligibility. The evaluation must be multidisciplinary, so it has to involve all facets of your child's development, not just focusing on the audiogram or the hearing loss or the speech and language of your child. No single procedure can be used as the only way that eligibility is established. So you can't just determine eligibility based on the audiogram that you bring. There has to be some other assessment that talks about how your child is functioning, and that functioning should cover all developmental areas. Now again, we're not assessing, so the extra information can come through parent interview or developmental checklists. There's a variety of ways to look at how children are functioning. And then we would also review medical and other pertinent records that the family may have that's associated with their child. Then the second step is the evaluation for eligibility. So we've established that there is a disability. Now we want to see if they're eligible for services. Unfortunately, in Texas and most states, all children with hearing loss are eligible for services under the age of 3. The services may vary depending on the needs of the student or the child, but they would get some kind of support. So again, the definition is that we have a child who needs early intervention, either because they have a developmental delay or they have a diagnosed condition that has a high probability of resulting in a developmental delay. And this is where sensory impairments come in. Obviously, when our babies are born and the hearing loss is diagnosed, there's not sufficient developmental time to evidence a delay. But we know that for most of our babies with hearing loss that there will be some delays that result from that hearing loss without intervention that's appropriate. Some states also have an at-risk category for infants and toddlers, where they can serve infants or support infants if they're not meeting the eligibility definition. But again, I think in Texas, most of your students, most of your babies and toddlers are going to be eligible on some level. Assessment, then, is the in-depth assessments that are done that are going to actually determine what kinds of services your child and you as a family receive. So here we're evaluating the child and we're evaluating the family. All the assessments have to be conducted by qualified personnel. The purpose is to identify the child's strengths and their needs so that we can develop early intervention services that will meet their needs. And again, assessment, just like in evaluation, has to look at all developmental areas, whether or not we think they're related to the diagnosis of hearing loss or not. The assessment needs to include the family's resources, what their priorities are, and what their concerns are related to enhancing their child's development. So again, families are in the driver's seat as part of this assessment process because it's what they bring to the table about their child that will determine the kinds of services that they receive and complement the other assessments that are being done. The Individual Family Service Plan, or the IFSP, has to be reviewed at least every 6 months to monitor progress. Remember, we talked monitoring progress is very important because we want to make sure that the plans that we have made for intervention are actually achieving the results that we expect, and then make revisions to services if we need to. And then there's an annual meeting every year to evaluate and revise the IFSP. When we transition to preschool, we're now in IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Part B. Part B is for children age 3 to age 21 or whenever they graduate from high school. That process needs to begin about 90 days before the child's 3rd birthday. And at that point, we're developing a transition plan for what testing and other activities need to occur in order to move forward with the assessment and moving into Part B eligibility. A difference with Part B is that we have categorical eligibility. In Part C, you're eligible based on having a developmental delay or having a condition known to cause a developmental delay. In Part B, you have to meet the definitions of one of 13 categories. So the different disabilities include hearing impairment, deafness, deafblindness, speech language, behavior, all different, 13 of those different categories. And there are federal eligibility statements, but each state actually develops their own eligibility definitions. If a child is not eligible at this transition point, there needs to be a meeting that discusses with the parents other appropriate services that would be available for the child. So one of the areas that we struggle with is many of our children who leave Part C, the early intervention program, are at age-appropriate developmental markers, and so they're not necessarily eligible under Part B services. So we want to make sure that if that's the case, that we talk about what other community-based services might be available for the child. A big difference between Part B and Part C is that you have to demonstrate adverse educational effect. So it's not just having the disability, but in order to be eligible, there has to be some educational implications of that child's disability. They also must require special education services and related services in order to address those needs. In addition, there is a new set of procedural safeguards for parents under Part B that are slightly different than Part C. And those procedural safeguards are very important as they outline specific guidelines that schools must meet in terms of timelines, appropriate assessment, who's involved in the assessment, in order to do the transition for Part B. The initial evaluation, when we do the transition, must occur within 60 days of parent consent. So you as a parent will sign consent as part of this transition process. This again is part of that transition plan that starts 90 days before your child turns 3. Then we have to make sure that the evaluation is done by qualified personnel so that those people doing the evaluation know and understand how to give assessments and how to interpret assessments for deaf and hard of hearing children. Most importantly, the evaluation must be sufficiently comprehensive to identify all special education needs and related services, even though some of those issues might not be commonly linked to the child's disability category, such as hearing loss. And this is the part that I think is really important because I believe that some of our children are found ineligible for Part B because we didn't do sufficient assessment at this transition point. So we really need to be sure we're identifying all gaps that a child has at this time so that we can make them eligible for preschool and on into school-age services. The initial evaluation also has to include a variety of assessment tools and strategies. So for parents, the functional and developmental information is really critical because you provide much of that information based on surveys and checklists about what your child is doing, and then any pre-academic information that is also involved in the assessment. And some of that information may also come from you as the parent. Those results then determine eligibility and the content of the IEP. And we're looking again at services that are going to enable your child to participate in preschool activities. And again, no single measure can be used as that sole criterion for eligibility. So we really want to look at the whole child, assess all areas, make sure we include social development, physical development, other areas that we may overlook, but that are just as important as the child's hearing, speech, and language assessments. So, as I said, we want to assess in all areas related to the suspected disability, in addition to other areas that may show up problems for the child. Also important is the tests that are used need to be technically sound and selected to accurately reflect your child's performance. So we don't want tests to be affected by a hearing loss or how your child communicates or their speaking skills. So as a result, we want to make sure that tests are administered in your child's native language or communication mode so that we can assure communication access on the test activities that are part of the test. And again, so that we're looking at actually what children are able to do, not how they access information.